The sky burned with the dying gold of a Texas sunset as the auctioneer's voice echoed through the dust-thick air, every syllable heavy with the weight of desperation and fate. Among the restless crowd of men, horses, and murmuring gossip, a frail girl stood at the edge of a wooden platform, her wrists bound loosely with a rope that spoke more of humiliation than restraint. Her name was Clara Mayfield, barely 20, her eyes wide and haunted, a heart caught between fear and disbelief. She'd never imagined her life would come to this. A girl once full of laughter and dreams, now standing under the scrutiny of strangers, her future sold to the highest bidder. The auction was not for cattle that day, nor for land, it was for her, payment for her late father's debts. The town had whispered about it for days, a cruel spectacle that drew men with rough hands and rougher hearts, all eager to own what they saw as another possession. But one man stood apart from them all, Luke Callahan, a tall, broad-shouldered rancher whose quiet demeanor drew as much curiosity as it did respect. His Stetson shadowed his face, but the sharp line of his jaw and the calm steadiness in his eyes said more than any man's shout ever could. While others laughed crudely and waved their coins, Luke watched Clara not with hunger, but with something that looked almost like sorrow. When the auctioneer's hammer slammed down and his deep voice boomed, "Sold, to Luke Callahan of Whispering Creek Ranch," the crowd gasped, and Clara's heart clenched. She had expected a cruel master, a man who'd remind her every day she'd been bought, but when Luke stepped forward, he removed his hat, looked her straight in the eyes, and said softly, "Miss Mayfield, you'll come with me, but you'll not bow to me. You're not property here." His words struck her like sunlight after a storm, disbelieving and warm. The murmurs around them rose, some mocking, some envious, but Luke didn't care. He helped her down gently from the platform, his hand steady and respectful. His touch was firm, protective, not claiming. As they rode away from town, the weight of the day pressed on Clara, and yet, for the first time in weeks, she felt something like air in her lungs again. The journey to Whispering Creek was long, winding through the golden plains where the wind smelled of sage and wildflowers. Luke rode silently beside her, every so often glancing her way as if to make sure she was still there, still whole. When they reached the ranch, Clara couldn't believe her eyes. It wasn't a place of darkness as she'd feared, but a home surrounded by life, horses grazing near the fences, a golden retriever bounding happily in the yard, and a warm cabin that glowed from the hearthlight within. "This'll be your home," Luke said simply. "You'll have your own room, your own space. Nobody here will harm you, Clara." His voice was steady, deep as thunder rolling across open fields. Clara didn't know whether to trust him, but when she stepped inside and saw the freshly prepared room, a dress folded neatly on the bed, and a vase of wildflowers by the window, something in her chest broke. She hadn't seen kindness in so long that it felt almost unbearable. That night, she sat by the window, watching the moon bathe the land in silver. She could hear Luke outside, talking to his horses, the gentle murmur of his voice mingling with the night wind. She realized he hadn't once treated her like something bought, or even something owed. He'd treated her like a person. Days turned into weeks. Clara learned to work the ranch alongside Luke, feeding the horses, tending to the garden, mending fences. He never raised his voice, never forced her hand. When she stumbled, he helped her up. When she cried quietly behind the barn, thinking he wouldn't notice, he left a warm blanket and a cup of coffee nearby without a word. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was healing. Slowly, Clara began to smile again, and when she laughed one morning as a foal nuzzled her hand, Luke looked up from his work and froze, because in that single sound he realized something deep within him had changed. He didn't just feel protective of her, he felt drawn, fiercely and quietly, like a man starved of sunlight finding warmth at last. But the town hadn't forgotten Clara's past. One afternoon, while Luke was away trading cattle, a group of townsmen rode up, cruel smiles on their faces. "How's life as Callahan's charity case?" one sneered. Clara stood firm, trembling but proud. She told them she wasn't a case or a pity, and when one of them tried to grab her, Luke's voice roared across the yard like a storm, "Let her go." His horse thundered to a stop beside them, his jaw set, his eyes blazing. "Touch her again, and you'll answer to me." The men backed off, muttering, but Luke's gaze didn't waver until they were gone. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not from fear, but from disbelief that someone had finally stood for her. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Luke found her sitting by the corral, tears glinting like the last light of day. I don't know why you're kind to me, she whispered. You bought me, but you treat me like I matter. Luke knelt beside her, his voice rough with honesty. Because you do matter. You were never for sale to me, Clara. I only paid the price to set you free. She stared at him, her heart breaking open under the weight of his truth. For the first time, she saw not just a rancher, but a man who carried his own kind of pain, a loneliness as vast as the plains. From that moment, something changed between them. The walls she'd built around her heart began to crack, letting in the light of trust. The nights grew softer, filled with quiet conversations by the fire, and the mornings grew brighter with laughter shared over coffee. But just as Clara began to believe she might finally belong somewhere, trouble brewed on the horizon. A man from her past, the very one who'd orchestrated her sale, returned with vengeance in his heart, determined to take back what he thought he owned. Luke didn't yet know that darkness was coming, nor that his choice to protect Clara would test the limits of his strength, his honor, and his heart. As the wind howled through the ranch that night, Clara stood by the window again, watching the stars shimmer like silent witnesses to the life she'd found. Maybe, she whispered, being sold was just the world's cruel way of bringing me to freedom. And somewhere outside, Luke's voice carried softly to her, steady and sure, no, Clara. You were never sold, you were chosen. The dawn broke pale and cold over Whispering Creek Ranch, painting the land in shades of silver and amber, but the peace that once wrapped the ranch like a warm blanket was gone. Clara awoke before sunrise, her heart restless, her thoughts circling the unease that had hung in the air for days. Luke had grown quieter, more guarded, though his eyes never left her for long. Something was coming, she could feel it in the way the wind carried a warning through the cottonwoods, whispering of old debts and unfinished battles. The man who had sold her, Eli Barrett, her father's cruel creditor, had returned to the county, spreading lies and venom. He'd told folks that Luke had stolen from him, that Clara was rightfully his, bought and paid for, and that no man could hide her away. The rumors reached the ranch like wildfire, but Luke didn't flinch. Let him talk, he said softly, his jaw tightening. Words can't take what's mine to protect. Clara heard that word, mine, and, though it should have scared her, it didn't. It comforted her, not as a claim, but as a promise. Days later, when the storm finally broke, it wasn't the sky that thundered, it was hooves. A dozen riders tore across the plains, dust rising like smoke behind them, and at their head rode Eli, his grin sharp as a knife. Callahan, he shouted as he reined in by the corral. You've got something that belongs to me. Luke stepped out of the barn, his hat low, his stance calm but ready. You've got it wrong, Barrett. She doesn't belong to anyone. Eli spat on the dirt. She was payment. You bought her. You can't just keep her like some fancy wife. Luke's voice dropped low, dangerous. I didn't buy her to keep. I paid to free her. The air between them crackled. Clara stood on the porch, fear twisting her stomach, but before she could move, Eli dismounted, stalking toward her. You think you're better than me now, girl. You'll come with me. He reached for her arm, but before his hand could touch her, Luke's fist met his jaw with a crack that echoed across the valley. The men behind Eli surged forward, but Luke stood like an iron wall, his hand on his revolver. If you ride one step closer, I swear by God and this land, I'll defend her with everything I have. Clara's heart pounded as she watched him face them all, one man against many, his body a shield between her and danger. The wind howled, kicking up dust, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The ranch, the sky, the horses, all frozen in the gravity of that moment. Eli wiped the blood from his lip and sneered. You'll regret this, Callahan. She'll bring you nothing but ruin. But Luke didn't move. Maybe, he said quietly, but if that's the price of doing right, then I'll pay it twice. The standoff ended when Eli, humiliated and furious, mounted his horse and rode off with his men, swearing vengeance. The dust settled, but the tension didn't. Luke turned to Clara, his hand trembling slightly as he holstered his gun. You all right? He asked, his voice gentle again. She nodded, but tears spilled down her cheeks anyway. You could have been killed, she whispered. Why do you risk so much for me? He looked at her for a long moment, the pain and softness in his eyes nearly undoing her. Because, Clara, I see you. Not what you were, not what they said you are. I see who you are now, and you're worth standing for. That night, a storm rolled in over the plains, rain hammering the earth like the sky's own reckoning. Clara sat by the fire, her mind spinning with all that had happened. Luke came in drenched from securing the horses, his hair plastered, his shirt clinging to his frame. Without thinking, she ran to him, pressing a towel into his hands. "You shouldn't have gone out there alone," she scolded softly, her voice trembling. He smiled faintly, tiredly. "You're learning to worry like a ranch wife." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and they both froze. The fire cracked softly between them, the air thick with unspoken emotion. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean." "Maybe you did," she interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. Their eyes met, and in that silence, years of loneliness, fear, and longing seemed to dissolve. He reached out slowly, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, Clara. Not of me. Not of anyone." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as tears mixed with the rain still on her skin. For the first time, she let herself believe that love, real love, was possible, even after everything the world had taken from her. Days passed, and life on the ranch began to find its rhythm again. Clara laughed more, sang while she worked, and Luke found himself listening just to hear the melody of her joy. The townsfolk, once gossiping, now began to whisper different things, that maybe the girl sold at auction had found her salvation in the quiet rancher who refused to see her as anything less than a woman worth choosing. But peace never stays long on land marked by greed. One evening, as the sun bled red across the hills, Eli Barrett returned, alone this time, but more dangerous than before. He carried a gun and a madness in his eyes. Luke met him in the yard, unarmed but steady. "This ends tonight," Eli hissed. "You took everything from me." Luke shook his head. "No. You lost everything when you started treating people like things." Eli fired before Luke could move. The shot cracked through the dusk, echoing like thunder. Clara screamed as Luke staggered, clutching his side. Rage and terror collided inside her. Without thinking, she grabbed the rifle Luke kept by the porch. Her hands shook, but her aim was steady. "Leave," she shouted through tears. "Or I swear I'll end this." Eli hesitated, saw the fire in her eyes, and for the first time realized she wasn't the girl he'd broken, she was the woman Luke had rebuilt. He turned and fled into the night, swallowed by the rain. Clara dropped the rifle and fell beside Luke, sobbing. "Don't you dare die on me," she whispered. "You saved me, you don't get to leave me now." He smiled weakly, his voice barely audible. "Told you, you were never property, Clara. You're my choice." She pressed her forehead to his, tears falling onto his cheek. "And you're mine." The rain poured harder, but by dawn, the storm had passed. Luke survived, though the scar would forever mark the price of his courage. Weeks later, Clara stood beside him on the porch, watching the sunrise over Whispering Creek. The ranch was alive again, full of laughter, light, and new beginnings. Luke slipped his arm around her shoulders. "You ever think about that day?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Every day. But I don't remember the fear anymore. I remember the moment you said I was free." He looked down at her, his eyes soft with love. "You were always free, Clara. You just needed someone to remind you." And as the sun rose higher, painting the world in gold, Clara leaned into him, knowing that though she had once been sold to a rancher, she had found something no price could ever buy: a home, a love, a life worth living.